Okay, welcome. Welcome, Chuck. Great to have you here today. We are so blessed tonight. Chapter 2, The Method and Organization of Dogmatic Theology. We are in the section, Pericope 17, entitled The Search for a Scientific Objective Theology. This comes right on the heels of the previous section, which was the turn to the subject, which exposed some situations. So basically, when we examined last week the turn to the subject, we had this introduction of these relativistic normative sources for knowledge. And so an objective viewpoint on the world was replaced largely with a subjective one. And very quickly, some of the limitations of that became clear, as if you turn everything to a relativistic, a subjective, subject-based perspective, then haven't you, if you're not careful, lost all pretense or claim to be speaking about truth in an objective sense and in an objective reality? And so this section here is perhaps a counterbalance that the liberalizing forces of the mid-19th century faced there. And without further ado, if it's okay, let me just throw it over to you for maybe your take on things and what you thought at a high level of The Empire Strikes Back, objectivity, which was so dead in the last section, we now has to be brought back in while still maintaining the nucleus of that subjective turn. So how did that strike you, my friend?
It is really interesting that, of course, as you describe it, The Empire Strikes Back. Given that Bavinck ends up on the side of at least some level of objectivity, perhaps not in the same way that some of the theologians he quotes in this section. Maybe it's even the Rebel Alliance that strikes back, but the good guys. But in any case, it is really interesting that already in Bavinck's day, this move away from classically liberalism. And Bavinck doesn't, in Reformed Dogmatics, he doesn't really refer much to, if at all, I don't recall seeing it in any case, to people like Karl Barth and some of the other sort of neo-Orthodox folks. But what he is describing is, to some extent, this move towards neo-Orthodoxy, which, of course, he has some concerns, Bavinck has some concerns with himself. But it is interesting that he's describing something really pretty early in history. He's recognizing contemporaneously this and recognizing contemporaneously some of the issues that may come with it. So that's one of the things that I find really interesting about this. There are some interesting lines in this section. Bavinck spends some time walking through some of the theologians and people like Frelch and others. But it's interesting that he makes a couple of interesting points. He points out that while there was this move to separate science and theology, to make them sort of very separate things, in the way we've also talked in the past about how philosophy and theology sometimes get divided, and philosophy becomes a secular subject and theology the religious subject that really has nothing to do with secular science. But then when there's a move back to doing something more scientific, something more objective, Bavinck sort of wryly notes that it seems that modern science cannot leave religion alone, even in this hidden quarter of the human heart, for not even the historical method is regarded as fully scientific. And what he's referring to here is that one of the methods that is being used, not necessarily a method that Bavinck buys into, to bring some level of scientific study to theology, or some objectiveness to theology, is this study of history of religion, and to study Christianity in that mode as far as history. And while he himself doesn't necessarily buy into that system, he also finds it rather ironic that when there's this move made to this somewhat more objective way of studying theology and dogmatics, that the scientists are like, oh, well, you can't do that. History, that's not a science. You can't do that. And tries to, again, push religion, push theology off into its own sort of separate mode, dividing the sacred and the secular, and just relegating the study of dogmatics to this little minor sacred closet somewhere that has nothing to do with the rest of the real world. I find that very interesting. And then, of course, Bavinck counters that, saying religion is always and everywhere a most important phenomenon, one that is fully deserving of examination and study. And this is true not only for historical, but for logical studies, although he says history of religions and psychological method can't be the method of dogmatics. So it's fun to read Bavinck, who in some ways is critical, it's almost like a pox on all your houses here, although in a very generous way, pointing out that even in this move back and forth between sort of subjectivity and objectivity, a lot of the theologians who are making these arguments still miss the mark about the true nature of theology and of dogmatics and the way that we go about studying.
Oh, I love that introduction. Chuck, I think you hit it with a milk truck. This century, let me step back for a second. It's not too misleading, though it's an arguable point. It's not too misleading to put Germany in the center of this movement. It's a continental movement. It's not just limited to Germany, but in some sense, it really is this German idealistic zeitgeist in the 19th century. And it's birthed several things that are defining features. And so we've talked on the philosophical side. We've talked about the Kantian revolution. We've talked about Schleiermacher and the search for the inner subject as the source, the ultimate normative source for knowledge about God and the world. And so as Kant, Hegel, others early in this idealistic continental movement were still nominally Christians, as we would measure. And I don't mean disrespect by it, but as we get later and later in this century, we see, we've talked about it before, almost a secular takeover. And in some senses, this is an interesting phenomenon to study because this cultural ethos comes in response to what came before it in the 100 to 150 years prior to the 19th century, which is to say the High Church period in the Protestant Reformation. So think here of your confessions, creeds, catechisms. Lutheranism is a dominant force on the continent in the Protestant side and even has influence on the Roman Catholic side. And so you have this early dominance of German thought and Lutheran thinkers. And yet within 100 to 150 years of this high point of the creeds and the confessions and the catechism, you have the 19th century almost as a complete repudiation. A dialectic step has been taken, and people in the 19th century, even German Lutheran leading thinkers in the community, and not all, by the way, but so many of them, looked back upon that high period and said in a disparaging tone, disparaging way, this is what we used to believe. We used to do things like catechize, to do things like study these confessions and creeds. We used to go to the scriptures in a way that we are now putting aside. And while we might still value the scriptures in an ancillary sense, we're looking for the inner light. We're looking for God as he speaks perhaps more truly to us, as he reveals himself directly through this universal charisma, this proclamation that comes down into the world and into communities of faith and belief. So this is a grand narrative as I see it. And so you have two, if you could call it the Kantian revolution, with Kant and Hegel and many others. This is not just those two figures, but so much of it related to the work of those two thinkers. You could call the impact of the Kantian revolution in German continental thought. You could really cite just two or three figures who were primary movers here, or maybe centralized movers in the sense that they are the biggest and most important influencers. And two of them here are mentioned in this section by Bavinck. So the first one is slightly earlier. In the generation before Bavinck, we have Albert Ritschl. And so he's a German Protestant theologian. And he's maybe carrying the torch of this neo-Kantianism as it interacts with Lutheranism. And in some sense, this is the birthplace. It's hard to say. Liberalism does not have any one birthplace. Schleiermacher is probably the earliest big example, but Ritschl in the Hegelian generation is probably the large figure. And then a generation later, a contemporary of Bavinck is Ernst Troeltsch. And of course, Bavinck mentions many others in this section. So it's not just a one. Luther was, in a sense, a one a one-person force of nature that God used to start this Protestant Reformation in northern Germany. And I'm not saying that Ritschl and Troeltsch were to liberalism as Luther was to the Protestant Reformation, but these are key figures. And Bavinck is describing what it looks like in this anti-confessional, anti-creedal time period. And so you see the development, initial steps in Ritschl, development in Troeltsch, and one of the big conclusions here is this new philosophy of religion, this new idea that the liberal humanity bring new tools, and with these new tools comes a deconstructed and then reconstructed form of Christianity. And it's this history of religion method. And in that sense, there is an underlying assumption that Christianity is only what these tools can prove. And if you've not deconstructed using those, if you've not taken up the mantle of the historian in this new liberal arts sense of the term, then that's an inferior theology. And so this break has really happened. And while we talk about the break in the Kantian side actually leading to the secular post-Kantian movements of names like Strauss, Feuerbach, Marx, and then others, when we're talking about Ritschl and talking about Troeltsch, we're talking about people who wanted the Kantian revolution, who wanted to advance on this basis of this new Geisteswissenschaften, this new liberal arts idea, this new humanities, secular humanity. They wanted this, and they didn't want what came before. And one particular thing that they didn't want with what came before was they didn't like the scholasticism of this high period. And that's an interesting thing. So classic theism, particularly the scholasticism of Aristotle, which was the dominant metaphysical school in the later Middle Ages period. You and I have talked about this, Chuck, before. Aristotle had in some sense conquered the academy, and now here in the 19th century, we have a throwing off of that mantle. And so while the Protestant Reformation was never simply a scholastic movement, in fact, Luther was very anti-scholastic. So while it was not a scholastic movement, it became so much associated with classical theism and the scholasticism of the late medieval period that it looked to be that if you were going to stay within the Christian framework, you had the scholastic academy. Now, you did have a part of Christianity that was outside of this. And for example, Bavinck would be a part of that. But we're talking about in broad sweeps and in popular sweeps here. And so the movement has started. The scholasticism of the high period is refuted. And with it goes ideas, for example, the commitment to what sometimes is called today a high view of Scripture, replaced instead by this low view of Scripture, which we've heard stated in various cases. The Bible is just a human work. The Bible is a book like any other, subject to the tools of criticism. And if carefully qualified, that's not necessarily objectionable. But at the popular level, the implication here was that we bring this new Enlightenment form of skeptical inquiry to these traditional understandings of the subject. We start using the tools, Chuck, and we start chopping with our knives, our skeptical knives, our historian's craft, and we find very precious little left. And then we start to rebuild, we start to reconstruct a Christianity that is unlike the Christianity of Luther and Calvin, but we still think has a portrait of Jesus, the Christ. At least Ritschl and Troeltsch think so. Now, of course, liberalism is not the only school of thought here, and there is still the conservative orthodoxies that are opposing this. But that's a broad sweep of things, and I love how Bavinck paints all of these pictures interacting. What did you think about that, Chuck? I used to love to play Risk, the game of Risk, as a child, and if you've ever played that board game, you had all these fun moving your army pieces and gathering your forces over here and attacking that place over there, and then the opponent doing that to you. And that's the sense I get, that there are pieces moving here that Bavinck is accurately describing through time and through space. And I really appreciated that. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, I very much agree with you on that. And I think that's a good way to put it. I like your analogy of the Risk game, because when you play Risk, you cannot just play defense. right? You have to play offense, but you also have to play some defense. You can't just go charging off on offense and not leave any defense behind. And so risk is this balanced game, right? Where if you lose your balance and you get either too offensive or too defensive, it can be a problem. And one of the things I really appreciate about how Bavinck goes about his discussion of these various philosophies and claims about theology is he does so playing both offense and defense. And one way to think about this, perhaps, and I was just doing a little bit of outside reading just in the hour or so before we got started here, is to think about it in terms of apologetics and elenctics, right? So in apologetics is mostly defensive, right? You're defending the faith against attack. You're making your case as to why these attacks against Orthodox religion don't work, and you're playing that defense, and you have to do that. And Bavinck does that, right? Where there's challenges to Orthodox Christianity, he plays some defense and makes the arguments why those challenges may not work. But he also goes on the offense. He engages in elenctics as well. And one of the places where he does that, I think, really well is where he spends some time making the argument that this idea that you can engage scientifically with religion in a way that is entirely presuppositionless. And he kind of attacks that idea. And he points out that in some ways, the emperor of presuppositionless scientific methodology has no clothes. and so as he walks through this, he says, look, total presuppositionlessness, and there's a nice big long German word that goes along with that I won't try to pronounce, but total presuppositionlessness renders study and research impossible. And he points out that even those who are studying religion and engaging in that study with the idea that there is something there, and he talks about Troeltsch, for example, he admits, and he says, look, it's not Troeltsch's aim to move from Christianity to the history of religion. He says, but it's his aim, as he stated it, to ascend from the latter to the Christian faith as the highest religion. And that's a serious aspiration on his part. He doesn't wish to deny that Christianity is the highest, indeed the absolute religion. He even acknowledges that Christianity publicly asserts that claim, and that claim is not untrue simply because it cannot be scientifically proven. But then he goes on to point out that if you try to then use sort of this presuppositionless study where you don't make any presuppositions about whether religion is true, whether religion is useful, whether those who follow religious practices are either normal or somehow they've got some psychological issues that just need to be dealt with. It doesn't work. You have to have some kind of presupposition, at the very least, that this is worth studying, that there is something here to be studied, that there is an end in mind. That, and Troeltsch, for example, claims to have this particular end in mind. And Bavinck goes on the attack then and says, look, this just doesn't work. And I appreciate his willingness to do that. And again, we've talked numerous times here about how Bavinck does this in a way that still gives credit to those who make those arguments and doesn't just attack them without any sort of basis, but tries to repeat their arguments, explain what it is that they're trying to say, and then use their own words to point out where the weaknesses are. And a very generous theology, as we often talk about here in our discussions. And I just really enjoyed how Bavinck does that. And in some ways, I think this section, or these two pericopes, 17 and 18, in some ways, to me, are a great example of how we Christians ought to engage with critics, with those who perhaps even fellow Christians who we agree with on certain various issues. He's very generous. He carefully delineates what it is these folks are saying, even to the point where sometimes you wonder, why is he going so deeply into this? He's really laid out very carefully what the other side is saying. But he does that because he now then he plays defense. He defends against attacks that are being made against Orthodox Christianity and the ways that Orthodox Christians believe that theology and dogmatics should be studied. But then he also goes on the offense as well and points out where there are issues in those other arguments as well. And I just found this to be a brilliant section. I have to admit that as I reread it in preparation for today, I had noticed that most of my notes, most of my highlighted sections, usually I'll have a lot of highlighted sections that sort of get into, okay, here's the argument, and here's point A, point B, point C, and let's draw the lines to the conclusion. I didn't do that so much with this one, just because I almost was in awe of just simply the beauty of his argument. And so a lot of my highlights are just these beautiful sentences, these beautiful conclusions that Bavinck comes to that just really lay out very, very well where he ends up in these positions. It's good stuff. And by the way, given that I found his arguments to be in some ways beautiful, it is also interesting that at some point here, Bavinck also talks about how even the idea of beauty and of aesthetics does play a role in it. And in attacking sort of presuppositionlessness, he even points out that the concept of beauty, the concept of what is the beautiful and the true and the good, requires some set of presupposition. And when I was a teenager, my dad used to use the term aesthetic normativity, to this idea that there is a set of norms for beauty and for the way things ought to be. And we used to tease him about that language. He would say, "What, are you going to write a love note to mom saying that she's aesthetically normative or what?" But it is a good term because it describes and points out the fact that even when we talk about things like beauty, we have standards, we have presuppositions, and Bavinck is pointing that out as well.
Oh, my friend, I completely agree. I abused this saying in our other volume, and I'm going to abuse it in this case as well. But this could be my favorite chapter in the entire work. But more seriously, you and I are going to be critical, largely speaking, of this movement coming from a position that is roughly 150 years, give or take, after this liberalizing movement got started on the European continent. Of course, it got started later in places like the United States, but in some sense, there's a symmetry here that I find very beautiful. You mentioned aesthetics. There's a symmetry that the liberals, the German thinkers of the 19th century, who were by and large walking away from their creedal confessional roots, not quite the theology of Luther and Calvin, but think of the high period. Here we are maybe 100 to 150 years after them, and we are neo-reformed. I don't know if that's the right term to use here. Maybe somebody's already taken that. But in some sense, we are the remnants of the intellectual descendants of those whom these thinkers are criticizing. And now we're studying them through Bavinck. And I don't know why, but I just see such a beauty in that whole thing. And this entire volume 1 in Bavinck's Dogmatics is entitled Prolegomena, first thing, things that need to be set up first. Before you can put on a play, you have to set the stage. You have to get the props in order. You have to test that the lights are working. You have to, everything has got to be in its right place before the actors can come out onto the stage and perform the drama. And it's an outgrowth of the modern inquiry. This modern liberalizing trend is that now the remnants of this high church theology, the remnants of Luther and Calvin, people like yourself, people like myself, we find that what happened in this modern age is so crucial and important that Bavinck has to devote one of the 4 volumes of his Dogmatics series just to cataloging and going through all that has happened here. And in some sense, while you and I are going to reject theological liberalism, there's no denying that movement has held up a mirror by which we see ourselves in. And so in some senses, the liberals have succeeded, at least in establishing a worldview that today you and I measure ourselves against with our worldview. And that has to count for something. Now, ultimately, there's a tragic component here, because as theological liberals sought to keep up with science and reason and quote unquote the new understanding, Bavinck's pointing out that something important is lost. Now, I'll just share one thing, that you have this idea. Bavinck talks about this history of religion's concept. Fulch, others, you have historical criticism, you have this idea that Christianity is something to be arrived at, a path other than let's say, the five solas of the Reformation. And so in examining the Prolegomena, we find that, Chuck, I have to ask, are our liberal friends even living in the same universe as us? And I don't mean this condescendingly or pejoratively. We talk about the outlook and this worldview and these comparative methods, these ideas that we can apply quote unquote scientific experimental methods to religious phenomena. So Chuck, if I was a theological liberal and I wanted to learn what Christianity is, maybe I wouldn't study the scripture. Maybe I wouldn't go into the theology of the creeds and the confessions and the catechism. What would I do? I would go out and I would conduct a poll. I would create a psychological profile, come up with a matrix of study that would lead me to some poll questions that I would use to scientifically take the audience apart, ask them about their beliefs at specific points, and then pull it all back together and synthesize it and make a scientific conclusion. In that sense, Christianity really isn't about what the scriptures teach. Christianity is what happens when you press, what happens when you stimulate people who say that they're followers of Christ. What comes out? That's the content of Christian dogma. And in that sense, we've taken a dialectic step. Liberal theologians in general seem to not feel that the study of the scriptures is particularly normative. Now, as you and I talked about in our other reading that we're doing, the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology, there seems to be some equivocation amongst theologians in this new regime. And that is, where does the Bible remain? And we see liberal theologians offer statements that seem they hold to a very high view of the scriptures, at least at a first glance or a first blush. But we don't see them normative. And when the praxis of Christianity comes out, we see them even less. And the way Bavinck points this out is amazing and seminal. And I think chapters like this and sections this are reasons why Bavinck is in some sense a gold standard for theology. I know of very few other Reformed theologians who have the capability to dispassionately live in both worlds and yet still at the end of the day declare an allegiance to the world that you and I live in. And I think that's high and noble, and I think it shows in his treatment here. Rarely, if ever, do I see Bavinck shown in better form than I see in sections like this, where he is unpacking with a commitment to honesty, the people who are going to conclude things so differently from the way he's going to conclude. And that is uplifting. There's an old story about a drill sergeant going down the line of recruits for a paratrooper unit. And the drill sergeant barks out to each recruit who's going to go on this jump. He says, "Recruit, why are you here?" And the recruit is supposed to answer, "'Cause I love to jump, sir." And then the drill sergeant says, "That is stupendous." He's giving his approval. And he goes down the line, and person after person, "Why are you here, soldier?" "Sir, I love to jump out of planes, sir." "That is stupendous." And then finally, the drill sergeant gets to the end and gets to the last person. And he says, "Soldier, why are you here?" And the soldier replies, "Because I love to be around people who love to jump out of planes, sir." And the drill sergeant doesn't quite know what to make of that. But that's how I feel about the way Bavinck organized the treatment here. I don't know that I'm impressed that this professor of theology has done this with this skill, with this degree of honor towards the people he's studying. And he's left me with his treatment, and I am ever edified by what he's done. And so I don't believe that I'm not the person who loves jumping out of the airplane, as it were, in this story. But I'm the person who loves to be with the people who jump out of airplanes, meaning that I don't have the skill that Bavinck has, but I love to be with Bavinck. And this is a strong section. So I've said the same thing 3 times, and I apologize for that. But that's why I really enjoyed this section so much. Let me turn it over to you.
And I really appreciate your referring to our other stream of discussions regarding the Oxford Handbook, because I think there really is a parallel here. We've been talking a little bit about how, as you've pointed out, some of the writers in the Oxford Handbook are, to some extent, are maybe trying to pull back a little bit on the project of liberalism, trying to grasp for some level of value and meaning to the actual text of Scripture, which I think we should appreciate that they're doing that they recognize the need to do that. And perhaps some of the arguments that Bavinck has made here and some others after Bavinck have made, and I think some of those after Bavinck, even if they don't cite to him, probably were affected by him. But what's interesting there is that there's still the concern that if your basis for creating theological meaning is still about things like, as you described, whether it's a study of the history of Christianity, sort of a study of like the pole that you described, or a way that might be described would be looking at a number of different streams of Christian thought, a number of different traditions. And it seems that even among some of those that we've been reading, there's still this sense in which they don't quite want to go all the way to placing the highest value merely on the text of Scripture, or at least making the text of Scripture the primary way that we come to know the truth. And if we try to look for these other ways, even if our goal is to find real truth and real meaning in the words of Scripture, if we believe that the way we find that is actually by appealing to tradition, or appealing to a study of the history of theology, or appealing to a study of sort of the psychological impact, or merely community, and all of these, by the way, are important things to consider, to study. Bavinck himself says that these are good things to study. We shouldn't devalue, but we also can't overvalue them. And it's when we overvalue them that we end up losing our way. And so I think that's one of the things that I've appreciated about reading this in conjunction with the reading that we're doing in the Oxford Handbook. And what we see then is this neo-Orthodox move, this move to at least some sort of understanding that the liberal project has failed, without getting at the underpinnings of why it is also doomed to failure, or at least to significant problems that are probably going to mean that we're going to have to abandon some of those projects, just as the project of liberalism is in many ways being abandoned by many. Not everyone, certainly, but by many. Let's just put it that way. And I appreciate that, how you have lined these two things up, and we can kind of learn in parallel along these two writers. And again, I think I've said this already too, but I think it's worth saying again, that there's a certain amount of prescientness in Bavinck, that he is seeing some of these arguments even in time before they really came to full fruition. And he's already recognizing some of the weaknesses. So that's also another real strength of it. I sometimes wonder, you do this alternate history, and of course, we as humans want to do alternate history. I think God in his sovereignty has chosen to cause history to move in particular directions for reasons that we may not fully understand. But you almost wonder, had Bavinck lived 100 miles to the west, and in Germany, had he spoken German instead of Dutch, and written primarily in German instead of Dutch, you wonder whether he might have even had a greater impact on some of these discussions, and maybe perhaps that his way of thinking would have impacted more widely than it did. Whereas really, to some extent, I think is really only coming into his own now as his works are fully being translated into English. He certainly had some impacts, and especially in the Dutch world. But you almost wonder, why did God have him speak and write and live in Dutch and in the Netherlands instead of someplace like Germany, which in his era was perhaps the center of theological and philosophical study in the world. There was a time when theologians all had to learn German because of that. Maybe moved away from that since, but you wonder. I don't know. And of course, we don't question the way that God has ordained for things to go. But it is interesting, at least, to wonder.
Chuck, I agree with you. And what indeed? You and I have talked in other discussion sessions about the thesis that has formed in recent years in my mind, that without meaning to overstate, in some ways, if I was walking down a dark alley at night, Chuck, and someone came up to me from behind, masked and with a gun, and had me turn around and said, summarize the theological movement in continental Europe in the 19th century and early 20th century, but do it in 2 sentences or less. I think the 2 sentences that I would use would be to say that theology in the continent in this time period was a choice between Herman Bavinck and Karl Barth. And I think most people made the wrong choice. Now, Chuck, I don't know where you live. We don't have a lot of robberies in my area where masked people go around asking those kinds of questions. But if it ever does happen, maybe now I don't know. I would be interested to hear how you might summarize it if you were accosted in such a manner. But getting back to Bavinck here and this quintessential liberal turn to the new Geisteswissenschaften, the new liberal arts and humanities, this new history of religions, comparative method that we use to religions. Christianity is just one religion among a number of religions, those kinds of presuppositions. Bavinck, there's 2 statements here that I want to highlight for this section that I think are so incisive. The first one I'm going to have to read. So Bavinck's conclusion, as you and I have talked about a lot, because Bavinck is so faithful to represent all parties in a discussion, it's sometimes not clear exactly where Bavinck stands necessarily on everything. But with respect to the liberal philosophy outlined here, he's crystal clear. And there's a particular ending of a paragraph that I want to read that I think is so insightful. Bavinck says this: in criticizing the religious turn towards theological liberalism, Bavinck says neither the concept of religion by which the modern philosophy of religion operates, nor its concept of revelation have been obtained by careful research, but have rather been supplied to it by romantic philosophy. Wow, mic drop. So Bavinck's analysis and opinion here is that the people who are crying for this comparative method as an ideal are turning out in the execution of their ideal to simply be operating within the realms of an underlying preconceived romantic philosophy. Bavinck continues, the notion that God works only and exclusively in the human heart and has retreated everywhere else from his creation is simply untenable. Now, Bavinck says about the liberal theologian, we have to make a choice here. We can consider the world in its entirety and in all its parts as the work of God's hand, and in that case also as a revelation of his attributes. The other possibility is that it originated and exists apart from God, but then there is no reason why we should believe in a revelation of God in the human heart either. Wow. So Bavinck is saying, Mr. Liberal theologian, you've brought 2 assumptions about reality that are not going to integrate. So either creation is all and completely the work of God's hand, or the other possibility is that it originates and exists apart from him, but you can't have it both ways and speak of a reality that originates and exists apart from God, but still has a God who reveals directly into the human heart. And when I read that, I was like, wow, that is amazing. So insightful. And then finally, one other major point is concerning, you mentioned earlier, talking about Bavinck's criticism of the drive towards presuppositionlessness, which, by the way, is a great term, and I wish I could say the German. I'm sure I'm already messing up the other German terms, so I should probably not take on a second German term here. But there's a sentence that Bavinck points out that seems fatal to these ideas of science and neutrality and presuppositionlessness. He says this: faith always and everywhere includes knowledge, and in accordance with this knowledge arouses a certain kind and degree of trust. Without faith, you have no resting place. Where then do you stand? This is related to Bavinck's other famous quote: truth seeks to be honored as truth. It cannot be at peace with error and deception. So I think we have a masterful conclusion, an insight that I would love to see a response to. Now, everybody and their brother in the theological world in the early 20th century, even up to the mid-20th century, responded to Karl Barth and his theology. And so in terms of Bavinck versus Barth, in terms of popularity, it's not even close. Barth was simply a standard bearer for that wing, and Bavinck not. And so you can find 8, 10, 12 first-tier theologians in the time since Barth who have responded to his theology. That's some measure of impact and influence. What I would love to see is I would love to see those who might be of a Barthian persuasion or even from the liberal schools themselves responding to Bavinck's analysis here. And to be honest with you, I think we sometimes get indirect hints. For example, we were talking about the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology. We were talking about chapter 19 in there, which is an analysis of the qualities and the value and the proportion and emphasis of that Scripture plays in the Christian religion, according to what I'll call, for lack of a better word, a systematic volume that seems to be descended from something close to the liberal forebearers. And let's say Kierkegaard, Barth, and down in and through there. Of course, Barth is anti-liberal in a smaller sense, but in this larger sense, these streams running through this Kantian revolution. But sometimes we see, like in that chapter, Professor Stephen Fowle sometimes gives us a response, though not directly. He doesn't say, Professor Bavinck says this, and in reply, we say this. Instead, we get these oblique references that groups of people who think along these lines are docetic, or what other the quality is. And I find the indirection in references and the asymmetry to be concerning and also very telling, because it says to me, Chuck, that one side is reading the other, but it's not clear that the other side is doing the same. And what are your thoughts on that? And as we close up here and think about the big picture.
Yeah, it is unfortunate that we don't have a great deal of dialogue specifically with Bavinck. And there's a part of me that wants to think that some of it is that Bavinck's just so good that there's a little bit of fear to engage. But there's also, realistically, because he has not been particularly available to those in the English who study primarily in the English language, maybe there hasn't been that opportunity. And I'm hoping that the fact that these volumes now are available in English and are becoming much more widely known, that they will have an impact. It's interesting, yesterday we were talking a little bit in the Oxford Handbook about, I mentioned a footnote that I had read where there is some criticism of some more recent contemporary philosophers, Van Hooser and Walterstorff, who, while they're somewhat different from each other, come from somewhat different strains of evangelical or reformed thought, certainly would have much more in common with Bavinck than with many of the others in sort of the neo-Orthodox project. And it is interesting to me that even there, it's relegated to a mere footnote that just basically says, they failed to make their argument, without really even saying why they failed to make that argument. Now, maybe, to be fair, maybe there is some of that discussion happening, and maybe specifically directed at Bavinck. It's going to take some time for that to really filter through. But I'm really glad that we have this resource. And frankly, that's why you and I want to talk about this Reformed Dogmatics, this 4-volume set, because there's so much there. And even if we only have a few people listen to us, or hopefully a few more than just a few, but even just those few who may listen and decide that they want to dive into it a little further, hopefully that even adds to that possibility of discussion and dialogue, and hopefully that discussion and dialogue can lead to maybe even a greater impact that Bavinck and his writing can have on the way theology is done. If there's just even a little bit more of Bavinck out in the world because of this project that we have, just talking as friends about this excellent set of books, I would say, hey, that was great. I'm glad that it worked out that way.